Secrets in the blood. The air in the delivery room was thick with a cocktail of antiseptic, adrenaline, and quiet tension. Machines beeped in steady rhythms, nurses moved like silent shadows, and the sharp fluorescent lights gave everything a harsh, unforgiving glow. Yet none of it mattered to Amber Hayes as she lay panting on the hospital bed, her hair plastered to her forehead with sweat. All she could think about was the sound. Not just one, but two fragile newborn cries filling the sterile air. Twins. Her heart both swelled with joy and cracked under the weight of fear she couldn't explain. Amber had known for months she was carrying two babies, but reality didn't sink in until she saw them. Two tiny boys, wriggling and wailing in the arms of the nurse. They were beautiful, identical in their pink, squalling faces, with fists curled like little rosebuds and tufts of dark hair already slicked to their soft skulls. But despite their identical appearance, something felt off. A tiny splinter of wrongness lodged itself in Amber's gut, sharp and cold. She didn't have time to dwell on it. The nurses bustled around her, cleaning, measuring, recording weights. One nurse, a serious-looking woman with silver-framed glasses and a stern jaw, glanced at Amber's chart before speaking. "We'll need to run the standard newborn screenings," the nurse said. "There's also a notation here to conduct a routine DNA confirmation. Just standard procedure for twins born under assisted care." Her voice was flat, clinical. Amber blinked. "A DNA test? Why?" The nurse didn't look up from the chart. "It's becoming more common. In cases where there's any history of complications in prenatal care, or, in your case, gaps in medical records." Amber's throat tightened. Gaps. The months she'd spent off the grid, away from prying eyes, hiding her growing belly in the back of her cousin's failing bookstore in a different state, running from something, though at the time, she hadn't even known what. "Is that necessary?" she asked, her voice thinner than she wanted. "It's just a formality," the nurse assured her. "Shouldn't take more than a few days." Amber nodded, though her stomach clenched hard enough to make her wince. The babies were wheeled away for their first checks, leaving her alone with her fear and the rhythmic whoosh of the blood pressure cuff inflating around her arm. The next day, Amber woke to soft crying. Her babies, hungry and impatient. She pushed herself up, wincing at the ache between her hips, and reached for them. The nurse placed the twins in her arms, and Amber studied their perfect faces. They were identical, weren't they? Her fingers brushed one boy's nose, then the other. Same nose, same chin, same fuzzy hair curling slightly at the edges. But as she stared longer, a creeping doubt tiptoed into her mind. Was it her imagination, or did their skin tones look just a shade different? One slightly darker than the other, as if kissed by a different sun. She shook the thought away, blaming exhaustion. It didn't matter. They were hers. Her son's. The fear only returned when she found the folded note tucked into her hospital bag. Just a slip of paper, no signature, no context. One handwritten sentence in sharp, aggressive pen strokes. "They're watching." Her breath froze in her throat. 2 days later, Amber was still in her hospital bed when the knock came. Not the soft knock of a nurse, but a firm, deliberate rap, the kind that belonged to men in suits who never smiled. 2 men entered without waiting for permission. They wore plain suits, neither expensive nor cheap, designed to blend into the background. One was tall and wiry, the other shorter with thick shoulders and a pinched expression. They flashed badges so quickly Amber couldn't read the names. "Ms. Hayes, we need to speak with you about the results of your newborn's DNA tests." Amber's pulse jumped to her throat. "What results?" The shorter man spoke, his voice a strange blend of politeness and underlying threat. "There's been an anomaly. Your twins, Ms. Hayes, they don't have the same father." The world seemed to tilt sideways. That's not possible," Amber whispered. "They're twins." The taller man stepped closer, looming over her hospital bed. "It's rare, but not impossible. Heteropaternal superfecundation. Twins conceived from different fathers during the same ovulation cycle. Amber's heart hammered against her ribs, panic rising like a flood. No, there's a mistake. The man's expression didn't change. We need to know the identities of both fathers. Her mouth went dry. She could barely remember that night. A charity gala she had no business attending, only there because her then roommate was waitstaff and Amber had tagged along. She remembered champagne, laughter, blurry faces, then darkness, and pain. "I don't know," she whispered. "I don't know who they are." The men exchanged a look, a wordless conversation passing between them. "We need you to come with us, Miss Hayes." Her arms tightened instinctively around the swaddled twins in her lap. "Why?" The shorter man softened his tone, but the kindness didn't reach his eyes. "This is bigger than you, Miss Hayes. One of the fathers. He's important. Important." That word clanged like a warning bell in Amber's ears. "I'm not leaving my babies." "Then we'll arrange safe transport for all of you," the man said, his gaze flickering to the door as if expecting someone. "But we need to move quickly." "Why?" Amber's voice was rising, her maternal instincts sharpening into claws. "What's happening?" The taller man finally broke his silence. "Because the other father has already found out." Amber's stomach dropped to her feet. "Who?" Neither of them answered. Instead, the door burst open, and a uniformed nurse stumbled in, wide-eyed and breathless. "There's a man down in the lobby. Security's holding him back, but he's demanding to see the twins." Amber's fingers curled tighter around the tiny bundles in her arms. "Who is he?" she demanded. The nurse hesitated, then blurted it out in one panicked breath. "Senator Royce." The world went deathly still. Amber's mind reeled. Senator William Royce, a man whose face was plastered on campaign posters in every city, whose smile graced every polished political ad about family values and protecting the American dream. A man powerful enough to make her disappear with a phone call. "He says the DNA results confirm he's the father," the nurse continued, voice trembling. Amber could barely breathe. "Which one?" she croaked. The nurse's face paled further. He didn't say." One of the suited men placed a firm hand on Amber's shoulder. "We need to leave. Now." Amber's grip on her babies turned white-knuckled. "And where are you taking us?" "Somewhere safe," the shorter man promised, though his tone said nothing was safe anymore. Amber stood, trembling, her babies in her arms. The door to her hospital room stood open, a sliver of the outside world visible through the gap. Footsteps echoed down the hall, heavy and deliberate. They were coming. And the only thing Amber knew for certain was this: whoever these men were, whoever the twins' fathers were, none of them would stop until they owned her sons. And she would die before she let that happen. Shadows in the bloodline. The cold air stung Amber's cheeks as she stepped out of the hospital's side entrance, her breath fogging before her eyes. One baby was strapped to her chest in a snug carrier, the other cradled protectively in her arms. Her hands shook, not from the cold, but from the adrenaline coursing through her veins, and the sickening fear curling in her stomach. The two suited men who'd come for her flanked her, cutting wide silhouettes against the dark sky. They said nothing as they guided her toward a plain black SUV idling by the curb, its windows tinted so dark they reflected only the pale slivers of streetlight. Amber's mind spun in frantic circles. This isn't happening. This can't be happening. But it was. Every breath, every step, every beat of her baby's tiny hearts confirmed it. "Get in," the shorter agent instructed, opening the rear door. Amber hesitated, glancing over her shoulder toward the glowing hospital windows. Somewhere inside, Senator William Royce was pacing, furious and determined. A man like that, rich, connected, untouchable, wouldn't let her vanish so easily. Amber had spent most of her life living in the margins, invisible to people like him. But now, with her sons in her arms, she'd become the center of a storm she didn't understand. "What happens if I don't?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The taller agent, who had barely spoken since arriving, leaned down so they were face to face. "Then you risk the senator using every legal and illegal resource he has to take them from you." His voice was low, almost compassionate, but it carried a weight of warning that made Amber's knees wobble. "Get in." She climbed in without another word. The interior of the SUV was silent except for the hum of the engine and the baby's soft breathing. Amber's mind raced as they drove through the darkened city streets. The twins were only days old, and already their futures were tangled in a web of politics, secrets, and power games. But there was one burning question she couldn't escape. Who was the other father? "Where are we going?" she finally asked, breaking the oppressive silence. "Temporary safe house," the shorter agent replied. "Until we can determine how much Senator Royce knows and how much danger you and your children are in." Amber swallowed. "What about the other father? Have you contacted him?" Neither agent answered. The taller man's jaw clenched, his hands tight on the steering wheel. The silence dragged, so Amber asked again, this time louder. "Who is he?" The shorter agent sighed, turning halfway in his seat to face her. "That's complicated." Amber's grip on her swaddled son tightened. "Try me." The agent rubbed his hand over his face, as if peeling away some invisible mask. The second father's identity triggered. Flags. When the test results hit the system, the database cross-check caught it instantly. Amber's breath caught. "What kind of flags?" The agent's face was grim. "National security flags." Her stomach flipped. "What does that mean?" "It means the second father isn't just anyone," the agent said quietly. "It means your son is genetically tied to someone the federal government has been watching for years." The SUV hit a pothole, jolting them all. Amber's heart stuttered. "Watching for what?" she demanded. The agent's lips pressed into a thin line. "Espionage." The word hung in the air like a thunderclap. Amber shook her head, unable to process the absurdity. "That's insane. I've never even left the country." "You don't have to," the agent replied. "Sometimes, the danger comes looking for you." The safe house was an unassuming split-level home on a quiet suburban street, indistinguishable from the others except for the fact that its porch light was off and the blinds were drawn tight. Inside, the air smelled of stale coffee and cleaning supplies, and the furnishings were plain to the point of sterility. Amber stood awkwardly in the living room, her twins fussing softly in her arms. The agents locked the door behind them and lowered their voices, speaking in clipped murmurs into earpieces she couldn't hear. She was exhausted, her body still recovering from childbirth. But sleep felt impossible. "Who is he?" Amber asked again, voice cracking with frustration. The taller agent finally answered, his expression a strange blend of pity and discomfort. "His name is Gabriel Costa." The name meant nothing to her, and the agent hesitated. "He's suspected of working as a ghost operative, someone who doesn't officially exist in any intelligence file, but leaves fingerprints on high-level security breaches." Amber's knees buckled, and she had to sink onto the couch to keep from falling. "You're saying my baby's father is a spy?" "We're saying," the agent said carefully, "that Gabriel Costa is a man the U.S. government has been chasing for over a decade. And now, he's genetically tied to your son." A cold shiver ran down her spine. "Does he know?" "We don't know," the agent admitted. "But the minute the DNA tests triggered the flag, so did a series of alerts in systems we can't even access. Someone out there knows about your son." Amber's hand went protectively to her son's back. Fingers splayed against the soft fabric of his blanket. Two babies, half-brothers sharing her womb, but born of different men. One a powerful senator, the other a ghost with no official past. "What does Gabriel Costa want with my baby?" she whispered. The shorter agent shook his head. "That's the million-dollar question." The next 48 hours were a blur of whispered conversations, tension-thick silences, and Amber's restless pacing. She rocked the babies constantly, the repetitive motion soothing only them, never her. Each time a car passed the house, she flinched. Every ring of the cell phone, an untraceable burner the agents provided, made her chest tighten until she could barely breathe. And through it all, a question gnawed at her sanity. How could she not remember? Amber wasn't reckless. She was careful to the point of paranoia after growing up in a world where trust was currency and secrets were power. She remembered the gala. She remembered champagne and music and laughter, and then nothing. Just fragmented moments. A hotel room that smelled of citrus and cologne. Hands, faces, shadows, and pain. Had she been drugged? Coerced? Used as a pawn in something she didn't understand? One baby whimpered, bringing her back to the present. She stroked his cheek, whispering, "I'll keep you safe. Both of you." A knock at the door nearly made her drop the bottle she was holding. Both agents were already in position, guns drawn, moving toward the entrance. The shorter one peered through the peephole, his expression turning to stone. He opened the door, and standing there, framed in the dim porch light, was Gabriel Costa. He was tall, lean but solid, with close-cropped hair and eyes, the color of steel under storm clouds. He wasn't holding a weapon, but his entire posture radiated quiet, lethal capability. And yet, when his eyes found Amber, when they shifted down to the babies in her arms, something softened. For a flicker of a moment, the ghost was just a man. "They're mine," Gabriel said quietly. Amber's grip on the babies tightened until they squirmed. "Only one," the agent corrected, his gun unwavering. "The other isn't." Gabriel's gaze locked onto Amber's. "Doesn't matter." The front door stood open, the chilly night air swirling into the house. Amber's heart hammered so loud she thought everyone must hear it. Her voice was hoarse when she finally spoke. "Why are you here?" Gabriel's answer was simple, but it carried the weight of an oncoming storm. To protect them. From him. He didn't have to say who. Senator Royce. And in that moment, Amber knew. Her sons were the rope in a tug-of-war between two dangerous men. One who would claim them for power, the other who would kill to keep them free. The weight of secrets. The silence in the safe house felt like the air before a tornado. Heavy, waiting, brimming with the pressure of something about to snap. Amber stood frozen just inside the doorway, her body angled between Gabriel Costa and the twins sleeping in their portable bassinets behind her. The agents hadn't lowered their guns. Gabriel hadn't flinched. Amber's fingers trembled against the doorframe, her mind spinning in too many directions at once. This was the man, one of the men, responsible for her son's existence. One father, a ruthless senator who saw them as tools to control, the other a ghost from the intelligence world, a man whose name was whispered in classified briefings and redacted files. And somehow, she was the woman in the middle. "I'm not here to hurt you," Gabriel said, his voice low and even. It was the kind of voice designed to calm someone who already knew they were standing too close to a cliff. "I'm here because you're in over your head. And so are they." He meant the babies. Her babies. Amber's fingers curled into her palms. "You expect me to believe you suddenly care." Her voice cracked, her exhaustion and fear spilling into every word. You don't even know me." His jaw tightened, the faintest flicker of something, guilt, passing through his eyes before vanishing behind a mask of practiced calm. "You're wrong." The taller agent shifted, his weapon never lowering. "How did you find us, Costa?" Gabriel gave him a flat, humorless smile. "If I wanted you to know that, you wouldn't be alive to ask." The agent's grip tightened, but Amber held up a shaking hand. "Stop." Her voice was quiet but commanding, a mother's voice, one born out of necessity, not confidence. "Put the guns down." Neither agent moved. Gabriel's eyes softened, just slightly, as he took in the protective stance of her body, the way she positioned herself as a shield between him and the twins. "You have no idea who you're protecting them from," Gabriel said softly. Amber's throat tightened. "Then tell me." Gabriel stepped inside the house, slow and deliberate, his hands still empty. Up close, she could see the small details. The faint scar near his temple, the silver strand at his temple that didn't match the dark hair. This was not a man easily caught off guard. Every movement, every breath seemed measured, deliberate, dangerous. But there was something else too, a kind of sadness buried so deep it was almost unnoticeable. "You don't remember me, do you?" he asked. Amber's stomach flipped. "Why would I?" The agents exchanged a wary glance, but Gabriel's eyes never left hers. "Because I was at the gala," he said, "the night they were conceived." The room seemed to tilt, the air sucked from it. "No," Amber whispered. "That night, it's a blur. I don't remember you." His expression darkened. "You wouldn't, because someone made sure you wouldn't." The shorter agent spoke up. "What are you implying, Costa?" Gabriel's gaze flicked to the agent like a blade. "That Senator Royce and his friends drugged her, used her." Amber's knees buckled, and she caught herself on the wall. The words made her skin crawl, nausea rising in her throat. "No, no, that's not." "You already know it's true," Gabriel said quietly. "You've known since you woke up the next morning and couldn't remember how you got there. Since you felt like something had been taken from you." Tears burned behind her eyes, but Amber fought them back. "You're saying you were part of it." Her voice shook. "One of them." "No," Gabriel said, and for the first time, there was real emotion in his voice. Bitterness, regret, fury barely contained. "I was there, but not for that. I was tracking Royce. He's been laundering money through shell foundations for years, some of them tied to foreign intelligence. That gala was a hunting ground." Amber's heart pounded so loudly, she could barely hear herself speak. "Then how did I?" Gabriel's jaw clenched. "I found you. After." The world narrowed to a pinprick. "What?" "You were already drugged when I got there," he said, his voice tight, controlled. "Royce left you alone for a few minutes. Just long enough." Amber's breath came in shallow bursts. "You?" "I didn't know who you were," Gabriel said. "I thought I was saving you." Tears streaked Amber's cheeks. "You." "And then," Gabriel said, his voice quieter now, "I found out you were pregnant. By the time I realized one of them was mine, Royce's people were already watching you." The agents stood silently, weapons still drawn but the tension shifting. Even they seemed uncertain now who the real threat was. Amber pressed a hand to her stomach, the ache spreading like fire. "You found out months ago. Why didn't you come to me then?" "Because it wasn't safe," Gabriel said. "For any of us." "Safe?" Amber's voice broke. "Nothing about this is safe. I've been running for months. I'm living in a house with 2 men holding guns, and one of my sons belongs to a man who could destroy me with a phone call. Safe was gone a long time ago." Gabriel took a step closer, lowering his voice. "That's why I'm here." Amber's legs trembled. "To do what?" "To make sure Royce never gets his hands on either of them," Gabriel said simply. "No matter what it takes." The night stretched long, with Gabriel seated at the kitchen table, hands steepled beneath his chin, while Amber paced the small living room, her arms wrapped around herself. The agents remained stationed near the front and back doors, radios crackling softly in the background. "I need to know everything," Amber said finally, her voice hoarse. Gabriel's gaze was steady. "What do you want to know?" "Start with why you were even watching Royce." Gabriel exhaled slowly. "Royce has been under surveillance for nearly a decade, off-the-books surveillance. Officially, he's a clean-cut family man running on values and economic reform. Unofficially, he's been laundering money through international shell accounts, buying influence in foreign governments, and using that leverage to silence anyone who gets in his way. Why would he drug and Amber couldn't even finish the sentence. Gabriel's jaw tightened, because Royce is the kind of man who believes everything, and everyone, is for sale. He and his associates had preferences. They'd target women they thought were vulnerable, women who wouldn't fight back. Amber's stomach turned. So you stepped in. Gabriel nodded once. I didn't expect. He glanced toward the bassinets, where the twins slept, blissfully unaware of the war their existence had triggered. But once I knew, I couldn't walk away. Amber's breath shook. And now? What do you want now? Gabriel's expression softened, just slightly. I want to make sure they grow up free, not as pawns in Royce's empire. A tear slipped down Amber's cheek. And you? Gabriel hesitated. I don't deserve a place in their lives, but I'll die to protect them. The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken history. Amber turned away, her hand resting on the bassinet's edge, her fingers tracing the blanket. You don't get to die, she said softly. Not until you help me make sure they're safe. Behind her, Gabriel's voice was a whisper in the dark. Then we have a deal. Outside, a black sedan idled down the street, headlights off, barely visible in the moonlight. A phone screen glowed inside, illuminating a stern face and a sharp suit. Senator William Royce stared at the blurry surveillance photo of Amber and Gabriel in the same room, his jaw clenching so tightly his molars ached. Find them, he said into the phone, and make sure the ghost disappears. Understood, the voice replied. The line went dead. The price of knowing. The early morning light stretched pale fingers across the worn carpet of the safe house living room, but Amber Hayes had been awake long before dawn. Her back was stiff from hours of pacing, her mind far too wired to rest, and her arms ached from cradling her babies long after they had drifted to sleep. The knock on the front door came just after sunrise. It wasn't the hard, purposeful knock of men with badges, or the polite rap of a nurse checking in. It was measured. 3 firm taps, evenly spaced. A message more than a sound. Gabriel Costa was already there before Amber could blink, his gun drawn and angled low, his stance relaxed but ready. The 2 agents who had been posted inside the safe house flicked quick, silent glances at each other, neither moving to open the door. Don't, the taller agent muttered. But Gabriel ignored him. Without hesitation, Gabriel opened the door and stepped onto the porch, his broad shoulders blocking Amber's view of whoever stood outside. The morning light framed him in stark silhouette, half guardian, half predator, and for a moment, Amber wasn't sure which side of him would win. The voice that spoke from the other side was one she recognized instantly, even through the muffling effect of Gabriel's body. The slick confidence was unmistakable. Senator William Royce. Funny seeing you here, Costa, Royce drawled, still playing the robe protector. I would have thought you'd be long dead by now. Amber's breath caught in her throat. She moved closer to the door, close enough to see past Gabriel's shoulder. Royce stood just beyond the steps, hands in his coat pockets, the morning sun catching the silver in his hair. He was dressed like a man on his way to a fundraising brunch. Pale blue shirt, expensive slacks, perfectly tailored overcoat. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, too smooth, too sure. He was a man used to winning. Gabriel didn't move. You're trespassing, Royce. You're in no position to lecture me about laws. Royce's smile sharpened. I'm here to offer Ms. Hayes a chance to avoid a very ugly future. Gabriel's fingers flexed around the grip of his gun. You're not offering anything. You're threatening. Perspective, Royce said lightly. May I speak with the mother of my child? Amber's entire body tensed at the word "my." Before Gabriel could refuse, Amber's voice cut through the morning air. Say what you have to say and leave. Gabriel's head turned slightly, his sharp eyes flicking to hers, silently questioning her decision. But Amber stood her ground, heart racing but spine straight. She wasn't the sane woman who had stumbled into this nightmare. Royce's smile widened, though his eyes held no warmth. There she is, Mother of the Year. Amber stepped onto the porch, her arms crossed tightly across her chest, her thin sweater no match for the crisp morning air. "What do you want, Royce?" "To help you," Royce said smoothly. "You're scared. I get it. 2 babies, no real income, and a complicated history." His gaze flicked to Gabriel. "And you're trusting a man with blood on his hands to protect you." Amber's nails dug into her arms. "Get to the point." Royce's smile disappeared. "Give me the boy." The words landed like a punch to the stomach. Amber's breath left her lungs. "What?" "The DNA doesn't lie," Royce said, all pretense of charm gone. "One of those boys is my son, and I intend to raise him properly." Amber's voice shook. "He has a mother." Royce's gaze narrowed. "A mother with no money, no political cover, and, if I'm not mistaken, a history of mental health issues." Gabriel's gun lifted slightly. "Watch your mouth." Royce ignored him. "This is a simple solution, Amber. You give me my son. In return, I make sure you and the other baby disappear safely. A generous trust fund, relocation under a new name, full protection from my less patient associates." Amber's fingers trembled. "You want me to split them up?" Royce shrugged. "They'll be too young to remember each other." The sheer coldness of his suggestion made Amber's stomach churn. Her babies, separated before they could even know the bond they were meant to share. She could almost hear them crying for each other in her mind. 2 halves, torn apart. "No," Amber said. Royce's smile didn't falter. "Don't be so hasty. I always get what I want, Amber, whether you agree or not." Amber took a step closer, her fear curdling into something hotter. "You don't own me, and you'll never own them." Royce's smile was gone now, replaced by something harder. "Then you leave me no choice." Without another word, he turned and walked back to his car. A gleaming black sedan parked just far enough down the street to blend into the morning traffic. Amber stood frozen, watching him go, her heart pounding so loud she couldn't hear her own breath. Gabriel closed the door gently, locking it behind him. "You shouldn't have come outside," he said softly. Amber spun on him, the fear and fury bubbling over. "I'm not hiding in corners anymore, Gabriel." His expression flickered, something like pride mixed with worry. "Good, because Royce doesn't bluff. That was your only warning." That night, Amber sat on the floor between the twins' bassinets, her back against the wall, her knees drawn to her chest. One hand rested on each bassinet, her fingers lightly tracing the edges of the soft blankets tucked around her sons. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the rhythmic breathing of the sleeping babies. Gabriel sat in the doorway, a silent shadow. "What do you think he'll do next?" Amber asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Gabriel's answer was immediate. "He'll go legal first. Custody filings, emergency injunctions, claims of parental rights." Amber's chest tightened, and after that, Gabriel's face darkened. "Whatever it takes." A cold shiver ran down Amber's spine. "He thinks I'm weak. He's wrong." The certainty in Gabriel's voice startled her. She turned to look at him, seeing the tension in his jaw, the sleeplessness in his eyes. "Why do you care so much?" she asked quietly. Gabriel's gaze didn't waver. "Because I've spent my life protecting the wrong things. Money, secrets, men like Royce." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You and those boys. You're the first thing worth protecting." Amber's throat tightened with unexpected emotion. "I don't know how to fight him." "You don't have to," Gabriel said. "You just have to survive long enough for me to do it." The weight of that promise was too heavy to accept. "They're my babies. I have to fight." Gabriel's gaze softened. "Then we fight together." The silence stretched between them, but this time it felt different. Not the empty silence of fear, but the stillness before a storm. Amber rose slowly, brushing her fingers against the baby's foreheads. "He'll come for them." Gabriel stood, his shadow stretching long across the floor. "Let him." Across the city, Royce sat in his office, fingers steepled under his chin, his eyes fixed on the blurry surveillance photo his operative had sent. Amber, Gabriel, and the twins in the same room. "Tomorrow," Royce said softly, "file the custody claim and leak the story." "Understood," the voice on the phone replied. "And if she runs?" The faintest smile touched Royce's mouth. "Then she'll wish she hadn't." The war had begun, and Amber Hayes was no longer just a frightened mother. She was a storm, a mother's war. The paper arrived before dawn, folded neatly in an unmarked envelope slipped under the front door. Amber found it when she stumbled into the hallway, bleary-eyed, after a restless night of pacing and half-sleep between the twins' feedings. She almost didn't see it, her foot nudging the corner before curiosity made her bend down and retrieve it. The envelope was thick, made from expensive linen stock, the kind only lawyers and senators used, embossed with a faint watermark that made her stomach twist even before she saw the bold black letters printed across the top page. PETITION before CUSTODY. Royce V. Hayes. Amber's breath hitched in her throat as her eyes scanned the legal jargon, every line sharper than broken glass. Custody, primary parental rights, unfit living conditions, psychological evaluation recommended. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might split open her ribs. He was coming. She stood frozen in the hallway, fingers clenched so tightly around the paper that it creased beneath her grip. The words blurred through her panic, but the message was clear. Senator William Royce wasn't bluffing. A hand touched her shoulder, and Amber jumped, spinning around to find Gabriel standing in the dim light, his expression hard, unreadable. "They move fast," he muttered, his eyes flicking to the papers in her hand. "I told you." Amber shoved the papers at his chest. "What does this mean? What does he have on me?" Gabriel skimmed the documents, his face unreadable. "They're throwing everything they can at you. Financial instability, no stable residence, your unexplained time off the grid while you were pregnant." Amber's stomach churned. "I was hiding because I was scared." "Doesn't matter." Gabriel's voice was grim. "They'll twist that into abandoning her responsibilities and demonstrating patterns of instability." Amber pressed her back to the wall, sliding down until she sat on the cold floor. "He can't take them. He can't." Gabriel crouched beside her, his gaze surprisingly gentle. "Not if we stay ahead of him." "Stay ahead of a U.S. senator." Amber let out a bitter laugh. "What does that even mean?" "It means we fight dirty." Amber stared at him, half expecting sarcasm, but Gabriel's expression was stone-cold serious. "There's no winning this clean, Amber. Royce has the courts, the media, and every corrupt official in his pocket. If we play by the rules, you'll lose." Her breath caught. "So what do we do?" Gabriel stood, offering her his hand. "We make sure the truth about Royce is louder than any lie he tells." Amber didn't take his hand right away. She'd spent so long hiding from confrontation, from danger, running instead of fighting. Now, every maternal instinct screamed that it was time to change. She took Gabriel's hand and let him pull her to her feet. "Where do we start?" she asked. Gabriel's smile was sharp as a knife. "We burn his house down, metaphorically, for now." The first strike. By noon, the petition for custody was leaked to the press, exactly how Royce wanted it. The story hit every news feed and social platform within hours, reporters framing Amber as an unstable single mother, a woman with a questionable past and no means to care for twin boys. The phrase "concerns for the welfare of the children" appeared in nearly every article, like a chorus written by Royce's PR team. But Gabriel was already moving. He didn't just make phone calls. He made threats. Through burner phones and encrypted messages, Gabriel reached out to Royce's skeletons, The people Royce thought he'd buried. Former staffers paid off after inappropriate incidents, accountants who'd cooked the books for campaign slush funds, and one particularly nervous political aide who'd left D.C. in a hurry after what was called an accidental overdose at a fundraiser. The aide, a woman named Kristen Vale, had disappeared from the public eye 5 years ago. Gabriel found her in under 6 hours. Amber sat beside him in the cramped motel room, her knee bouncing with nervous energy as Gabriel's fingers danced over his laptop keyboard, encrypted chat windows flashing. "She's scared," Gabriel said quietly. "She's seen what happens to people who talk." Amber clenched her fists in her lap. "Tell her I'm scared too." Gabriel's gaze flicked to her, softening for half a heartbeat. Then he typed, "We're not asking you to testify. We just need proof." A long pause. "I kept everything." Kristen's reply appeared on screen. "But if he finds out I helped you." "He won't." Gabriel's fingers moved fast. "Send it." 2 minutes later, an email attachment appeared. A digital folder labeled Royce. Private. Do not open. Amber held her breath as Gabriel opened it. Emails, receipts, photos. Documents showing private jet manifests, payments routed through offshore accounts, correspondence between Royce's campaign team and a shadowy security consultant, with direct ties to foreign defense contractors. And worse, records detailing the private parties Royce and his associates held under the guise of fundraising events. Amber's stomach turned. It was all there. Proof that Royce wasn't just a predator. He was a man who had built his career on power bought through silence and ruin. Amber's hands shook. "We have to go public." Gabriel's jaw tightened. "We will, but not yet." Amber's breath caught. "Why not?" "Because if we go public now, he'll bury us in the noise." Gabriel's voice was cold, calculating. "We don't just expose him. We bleed him out, slowly." Amber's heart pounded. "How?" Gabriel's eyes gleamed. "We let him think he's winning." The custody hearing. The hearing was scheduled within the week, Royce's influence moving the process faster than Amber could have imagined. She stood outside the courthouse, the twins nestled in their double stroller, her palms sweating as reporters shouted questions across the plaza. "Ms. Hayes, is it true you fled the state to avoid responsibility? Are you in contact with the baby's fathers? Do you have proof of your ability to care for them?" Gabriel stood beside her, his presence a wall between her and the press. His gun was hidden beneath his jacket, but Amber knew it was there, a silent promise that no one would touch her or her sons. Inside, the courtroom felt too big and too cold. Royce sat at his table, his lawyers slick and confident, their stacks of paperwork towering like fortresses. Amber's legal aid lawyer, a woman named Carla, barely had a thin folder. Royce's lawyer stood, her voice polished and cool. "Your Honor, my client is merely seeking what is best for his biological son, a safe, stable home." Amber's fists clenched under the table. Gabriel sat in the back row, silent, watching. When Amber took the stand, her voice shook at first, but with each word, she found steel beneath the fear. "I love my sons," she said, her hands trembling on the witness stand. "I've protected them since the moment I found out they existed. They deserve to grow up together, safe, not as pawns in someone else's game." Royce's lawyer smirked. "Do you have proof that Senator Royce is unfit?" Amber's lips parted, but she glanced at Gabriel. He gave the smallest shake of his head. "Not yet." "No," Amber said softly, "but I know what kind of man he is." The lawyer turned to the judge, smug. No further questions. The first leak. That night, the first document from Kristen's file hit an anonymous whistleblower blog, a seemingly minor expense report showing payments from a foreign defense lobbyist directly to Royce's personal account. A ripple, barely noticed. The next day, another leak. Private emails between Royce and the lobbyist, and then photos. Royce at one of his fundraisers, a barely legal girl seated in his lap. By the third day, it wasn't a ripple. It was a wave. Amber rocked the twins in the safe house, watching the news, her heart pounding as anchor after anchor repeated the same words. Ongoing investigation into Senator Royce's misconduct. Gabriel stood at the window, watching the street, waiting for the inevitable. "Do you think it's enough?" Amber asked. Gabriel's smile was grim. "It's only the beginning." The war had started. And this time, Amber wasn't running. Blood, truth, and the breaking point. The wind rattled the windows of the safe house, whispering against the glass like something trying to find its way inside. Amber stood in the nursery doorway, her arms folded tightly across her chest, watching her sons sleep in their twin bassinets. Their identical chests rose and fell in rhythm, unaware of the storm brewing outside. Two perfect babies, one child of a ghost, the other of a monster. A mother caught between. The foam on the kitchen counter buzzed, its sound jagged against the silence. Gabriel, seated at the small table, didn't flinch. He'd been expecting the call. Without looking at the screen, he answered. "He's moving." Gabriel's voice was low, controlled. "Are you sure?" Amber couldn't hear the voice on the other end, but Gabriel's posture stiffened slightly. "Understood," he said, before hanging up. Amber's stomach tightened. "What does that mean?" Gabriel's jaw flexed. Royce just accelerated his endgame. He's skipping the rest of the hearings and filing an emergency petition. By tomorrow morning, he'll have temporary custody if the judge sides with him. Amber's knees nearly gave out. He can't do that. Gabriel stood, his expression dark. He can do anything if he buys the right people. Amber clutched the doorframe to steady herself. "What do we do?" Gabriel's eyes flicked to the baby's room, then back to her. "We don't wait for morning." Midnight escape. The plan wasn't complicated. Simple was safer. Amber packed only what they needed. Diapers, formula, a few changes of clothes. The rest didn't matter. Gabriel moved through the house with silent efficiency, securing bags, erasing traces of their stay, checking his weapons. The agents posted at the safe house exchanged uneasy glances, but didn't intervene. They had their orders: protect Amber and the twins, but Gabriel answered to no one. The moment the twins were buckled into their car seats, Amber felt the weight in her chest ease. Just a little. They were leaving. That was what mattered. Gabriel drove, his hand steady on the wheel, his eyes constantly flicking to the rearview mirror. Amber sat in the back between the boys, her hands resting protectively on their seats, her heart pounding with each mile they put between themselves and the house. "Where are we going?" Amber asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "To someone Royce can't touch," Gabriel said. Amber's stomach turned. "Who?" Gabriel's eyes caught hers in the mirror. The one person more dangerous than him. The forgotten name. The car rolled to a stop outside an unmarked building in a part of the city Amber didn't recognize. The kind of neighborhood where people didn't ask questions because questions got you killed. Gabriel got out first, scanning the empty street, his fingers brushing the grip of his gun. Amber unbuckled the babies, moving quickly but carefully, the cold air biting at her skin. The building was a former warehouse, its windows blacked out, its heavy steel door showing no signs of life. Gabriel knocked once, paused, knocked twice more. A pattern. The door creaked open just wide enough to reveal a man in his 50s, his face weathered, his eyes sharp. His left ear was missing the top half, a jagged scar running down his neck. His gaze flicked to the twins in Amber's arms. "Hell, Costa," the man muttered. "You don't show up for years, and now you bring babies." Gabriel's smile was humorless. "You owe me." The man stepped aside, waving them in. "I don't babysit." "We're not staying long," Gabriel said. "Just long enough to break Royce." The man, whoever he was, let out a dry laugh. "Breaking senators isn't what I do anymore." "It is tonight," Gabriel said. Amber's arms tightened around her sons. "Who is he?" The man offered her a hand, his fingers calloused, his grip firm. Name's Walsh. Used to work for the kind of people who make Royce look like a mall cop. Amber's heart skipped. Why would you help us? Walsh's grin was sharp. Because Gabriel saved my life once. And because the only thing better than money is revenge. The full picture. Amber sat in the corner of the room, her back against the wall, her sons asleep beside her in a borrowed playpen. Gabriel and Walsh stood at a rusted metal desk, papers and files spread across its pockmarked surface. Here, Walsh said, jabbing a finger at a printed email thread. This is the connection we needed. Amber stood slowly, the ache in her back and knees fading beneath the weight of curiosity. What connection? Gabriel turned to her. Proof Royce knew about you before the gala. Amber's breath caught. What? Walsh handed her a sheet of paper. Royce didn't just happen to pick you. He knew exactly who you were, and who your mother was. Amber's stomach lurched. My mother. Gabriel's jaw clenched. Your mother testified against Royce's father 30 years ago. A federal case that almost destroyed the family before they bought their way out. Amber's mind reeled. Her mother had rarely talked about the past, only ever mentioning that she made some enemies before they packed up and moved halfway across the country. She was a witness, Gabriel said. Royce didn't forget. Amber felt like the ground beneath her feet was crumbling. So he targeted me because of her. Walsh nodded. Royce doesn't just punish his enemies. He wipes out their bloodlines. Amber's hand flew to her mouth, her stomach turning. But you weren't supposed to get pregnant, Gabriel added softly. That changed everything. Amber's knees buckled. What happens now? Gabriel met her gaze, his eyes fierce and unyielding. Now we burn him to the ground. War in the open. They made the drop just before sunrise, not to the press, but directly to a federal watchdog group already investigating corruption tied to Royce's financial dealings. Emails, photos, financial records, witness statements from women silenced by non-disclosure agreements. Every piece of dirt Gabriel and Walsh had collected over the past decade was unleashed at once. By the time Amber was feeding the twins their morning bottles, Royce's face was plastered across every news channel, his denial sharp but hollow. Unfounded, he snarled at reporters. A political smear campaign orchestrated by enemies of progress. But the documents didn't lie. Neither did the women stepping forward. One by one, they told their stories, of drugs slipped into their drinks, of waking up in unfamiliar rooms, of whispered threats and envelopes stuffed with hush money. By midday, Royce's campaign manager resigned. By evening, the first calls for impeachment were echoing through Capitol Hill. The final move. Amber stood on the sidewalk outside the courthouse, Gabriel beside her, the twins bundled in the double stroller. Reporters swarmed, microphones thrust forward, cameras flashing. Ms. Hayes, what do you have to say about today's ruling? The judge's decision had come swift. Royce's petition for custody dismissed, the evidence against him too damning to ignore. The court had ruled in Amber's favor, granting her full parental custody and placing a federal restraining order against Royce. Amber's voice shook, but her words were clear. My only goal was to protect my sons. Are you afraid of retaliation? A reporter called. Amber's fingers tightened around the stroller handle. I'm not afraid anymore. Gabriel stood silent beside her, his presence a reminder that fear wasn't her only option. The final price. That night, Amber sat in the nursery, rocking her sons, the moonlight silver on their soft faces. Gabriel stood in the doorway, a shadow in the night. You could leave now, Amber said softly. You don't owe us anything. Gabriel stepped inside, kneeling beside the rocking chair. I owe them everything. Amber's hand rested on his, her fingers warm against his rough skin. You're not just a ghost anymore, she whispered. Gabriel's throat tightened. Neither are you. Amber leaned her forehead against his, the weight of fear lifting. Not entirely gone, but lighter. For the first time, they weren't just survivors. They were a family.